Moderator Sergei Ryabkov, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Роберт Легвольд, почетный профессор Колумбийского университета США.
Robert Legwold, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Sciences, Columbia University, USA.
Андрей Сушенцов, декан факультета международных отношений МГИМО МИД России.
Андрей Сушенцов, Dean of the School of International Relations, МГИМО University.
Дженнифер Кавана, старший научный сотрудник и руководитель программы военного анализа аналитического центра Defense Priorities США.
Jennifer Kavanagh, Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities, USA.
Виктория Журавлева, заместитель директора ИММО РАН.
Виктория Журавлева, Deputy Director for Scientific Work, Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations.
Добрый день.
Hello, distinguished colleagues, friends, dear guests. It's a great honor for me to be at this stage, particularly since we are to discuss the matters which are not trivial and which have the direct impact on the global situation, conflicts, the relations between Moscow and Washington. All these things will have the direct relation to the global agenda and comprehensive agenda. Let me, as in opening remarks, pinpoint some topics, and then addressing to our distinguished panelists, who I'm absolutely positive will add up to intellectual work within Primakov Readings work, to set the questions to which we and all our audience want to get at least evaluations and judgments. First of all, decades of leadership of the United States on the global arena have been marked as by serious level of stability and predictability. I'm not going to talk about the problems associated with bipolar world, Cold War, and all those things which happened after the collapse of the USSR. I will draw your attention to the fact that partners, allies, and adversaries of the United States, whoever they are, have always based on the fact that the change of Washington administration, in fact, is not equal to the drastic change in priorities and approaches to the international relations. Consistency of foreign policy of the United States was one of those constants which could be oriented at regardless of the party dominance in the administration in Washington. The foreign policy mostly was a platform for cooperation and collaboration between two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, amid their severe debates over domestic matters in the United States. But the revolution by Trump has reached the foreign policy, this strive of American president to make America great again, caused revision of partner agreements and relations, and into the transformation of traditional alliances, which is still going on. The Republicans mostly united around the president, supporting this new trajectory. The other thing is that specific mottos and narratives interpreted as the teaser for the future in Washington to strive for domestic matters and not foreign policy. So these announcements in running campaign are still decorations, and the practice demonstrates different. Democrats, according to our assessment, still support the concept of uniting liberal forces and powers in globally in the fight against those who they regard as the dictator regimes. But the ideological differences between the parties are so deep that even today the world starts to guess what kind of foreign policy of the United States will be after midterm election in the United States in November and in the aftermath of the next presidential election in the United States in 2028. To understand that, together we need to try to look ahead at the foreign political kitchen of the United States without turning blind eye on party and institutional differences and disagreements in current Washington. Turning to our panelists, let me ask several specific questions. How deep and big was MAGA or MAGA revolution for the Republicans? What are long-term ramifications of this MAGA revolution for the Republicans and for the supporters? On the other hand, what is happening to the Democratic Party? Is there any prospect of getting out of this long-term leadership crisis, and how can this party respond to the requests of the Democrat voters, not when it comes to the personal agenda, but the ideological agenda? If there is a chance for bipartisan reconciliation, can Democrats and Republicans propose to the American voter a compromise-based social, economical, and political development? Can the current trajectory for confrontation against China ensure bipartisan approach in the authorities and in the society? A very interesting question to ask would be, how can the presidency of Trump change, and whether it is changing the balance of powers in Washington? And of course, the main point, what should Russia expect from this balance of powers in the United States and after its possible change, given the expected results of interim elections in November current year and further on? So this is a set of questions. I do believe that the questions from our audience will follow and will be deep and meaningful. Right now, I don't want to waste much of your time. Let me give the floor, and it's my privilege to do so, to distinguished Robert Legwald. Everybody knows this distinguished professor emeritus of the Columbia University, a great specialist on Russia, who specializes in the relations between our two countries for many decades already, and who brought several generations of specialists in international relations. Over to you, Professor. Thank you.
Back again at the Primakov Readings. and particularly Sergei Alexeyevich, to be under your chairmanship. I won't attempt to answer all of the questions that you posed to the panel, because I want to make a very fundamental point about what we're going through now in the United States under the Trump administration. And it starts by echoing some of the things that you've already said. The Trump administration represents a fundamental and a historic break with the last 75 years of U.S. foreign policy. The key question is, how enduring will it be? And that's what I want to focus on today. The administration's break with the past is both dramatic and it's sudden, although it does have its roots in the first Trump administration. He has, as you suggested, abandoned leadership of what 9 previous U.S. administrations conceived of as the liberal international order, and substituted for that a narrowly focused America foreign policy. In short, the transformation is from an alliance-based multilateralism with rules, granted American defined, and substituted for that a quest for asymmetric advantage extracted from allies and adversaries alike. It's an approach that views relations with both allies and adversaries as basically zero-sum. It's an approach that is wary of rules and norms and institutions as constraining its freedom of action. What's more important, however, and this is my single central point that on dealing with the Trump administration, in effect encounters many of the questions you've put. The most important point about the change underway, however, is that the transformation in U.S. foreign policy is not in parallel with the domestic transformation that's taking place in the United States. It is a function of the domestic transformation that's taking place in the United States. Historically, U.S. foreign policy has been separate, although dependent on the domestic dimension. Domestic for public support, dependent for public support, dependent for on the condition of the economy, dependent for the military resources that are provided. But the design and the content of foreign policy has been the product primarily in the minds of U.S. leaders of the way in which they define the challenge and the threat of the international environment. And then the orientation, the strategy, as was containment during the original Cold War, is exported to a domestic setting that was marked for most of the time by large-scale domestic buy-in. In contrast, the Trump administration's behavior abroad is an extension of, and it is a necessary complement of what's attempting to do within the United States. The goal is to change the system, not merely the government. And the change that's then imposed on the international system flows from this. Trump believes, as he has said when commenting on the punishment that was imposed on the rioters that were part of the January 6th insurrection, the following. He said, a massive fraud of this type and magnitude, he's not referring to the insurrection, he's referring to the punishment of the insurrectionists, allows for the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution. The kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, the war against Iran, the military destruction of allegedly drug-carrying boats in the Caribbean and in East Asia is a reflection of the attitudes of this administration toward laws and institutions in general. The support for Viktor Orban and for Javier Milei stems from the support and the legitimacy that their political model or their economic model provides for the model that the Trump administration has in mind for the United States. when its national security strategy, that of the Trump administration, condemns our European allies for what is referred to as civilizational erasure, that justifies the administration's attack on DEI, that is, the values of diversity and equity and inclusion. And it comes very close to the notion of great replacement theory, which is popular and embraced by important parts of the administration. The Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is part of this national security strategy, with its emphasis on limiting the influence and the economic competitiveness of what the document refers to as non-hemispheric powers, is parallel to and very similar to the administration's efforts to weaken and handicap political opposition of all kinds, including in electoral forms within the United States. The list is longer, I could go on, but time is short. If this is correct, then the answer to the question that I posed at the outset, how enduring is this foreign policy revolution likely to be, depends on the answer to the question of how deep and lasting is this domestic transformation. In the last U.S. presidential election, the Democratic Party campaigned on the threat that a re-elected Trump would pose for democratic institutions in the United States. The strategy failed. Voters instead acted primarily on their negative reaction to the 4 years that they had experienced under the Biden administration. Current public opinion suggests that this may have changed, but the implications of this are still unclear. The polls show that the Trump administration's attack on democratic institutions now does matter to a majority of the American people. But the top issues for them are different at this point, not surprisingly. For 74% of those who are polled, the top issue is the economy, the affordability issue. For 68%, it is health care. For 54%, it is immigration. And only then comes the fear of the attack on core institutions in the United States. But as I said, it's now a majority. It is 52%. Judges and legislators are acting in ways that stop or that impede the actions of the administration. But this is only slowing or impeding. It is not reversing the trend or the course that the administration is on. Trump's historically low polling numbers at this point around most of the major policy issues, together with the overall question of approval, suggests the possibility that the administration will lose in the fall elections one or both houses, and that would further slow, but it would not halt the administration's course. So it comes back to, again, a point that Sergei Alexeyevich was making, the future of the Trump administration's domestic transformation, and therefore the future of the foreign policy transformation depends on the outcome of the 2028 presidential election. There are four possible outcomes. The first is that J.D. Vance or somebody of his thinking wins. This would require that the administration overcomes the policy failures of these first 2 years, and that the high level of disapproval for the Democratic Party continues. In this case, the domestic revolution underway would continue, but without the narcissistic excesses of Trump, and the America First policy would continue, but without the military recklessness of this Trump administration. It might permit something of a normalization of relations with Russia, but China policy and the relationship with China, in my view, would remain in a very unsteady balance between managing strategic rivalry, which is somewhat in the cards today, and the continuing trend toward genuine Cold War between the two sides. The second outcome might be the election of a candidate more in the traditional Republican mold, In this case, because of the electoral failures of the 3 years leading to the election and a clear-cut rejection of the Trump policy agenda, Trumpism's hold on the party would be broken. The domestic transformation currently underway would, in my view, subside into a more traditional conservative agenda that adheres to laws, the Constitution, and the system's checks and balances. And as a result, U.S. foreign policy, in this case of a more traditional Republican leader, would probably lose its unilateralist, hard-edged, zero-sum bargaining quality, but it would retain its hawkish quality toward Russia and to China, in my view. The third outcome might be a moderate Democrat who's elected. The Trump domestic transformation would not only be abandoned, it would be formally condemned, and the Russian and the Trump foreign policy transformation or revolution would be formally jettisoned. I think you would have a return to something that looks like the foreign policy of recent Democratic administrations, but I think it would be with a sense or a notion now that the U.S. role in international politics must be more modest. It can't be the indispensable nation that we had in the early years after the end of the Cold War. The fourth, and I'll finish with this outcome, would be a candidate from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, a national replication of the election of the Democratic Socialist Zoran Mamdani in the New York mayoral election. This could happen only if there is a really broad-based rejection of both establishment political parties. There's something of an inkling of this right now. In the United States, 4 major cities in the United States will have Democratic Socialist mayors. And there is a kind of a movement within the country around this, but my own view is it's not likely, in fact, to reach to the level of national politics along the way. The agenda in this case, however, would shift from transforming the political system to reworking the economic system. The foreign policy would lose its geostrategic focus. The role and the size of the U.S. military would be reduced. The agenda would focus on global issues like climate change. I don't think that Russia policy and policy toward the Ukrainian war, even in this case, would change fundamentally. I think policy toward China would be softened, and there would be more of an inclination to avoid the drift toward deepening Cold War. And my final point, and I finish with this, I remind myself that over the last decade of U.S. foreign policy, the least expected is what has happened. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Blackwold. Thank you for a profound analysis of the situation, and thank you for your predictions. Sadly, the relations between Washington and the rest of the world could be described as a zero-sum game. And whether the system could be transformed, that deserves a lot of discussion. This is a too serious thing in order just to merely state that without proper analysis. And probably I will abuse my role of a moderator. But let me highlight one question for our subsequent discussion. Engaging the audience, and still my question goes to you, Professor. Analyzing the full scenario, the full outcome, you alluded to the socialist views of the potential representative of the leftist Democratic Party. I don't see any socialist views anywhere. Probably this is a result of my former communist background and upbringing. But if you could comment on that, what the socialist views are now in the United States, in the modern United States, and in the United States 2.5 years from now, we would appreciate that very much. I'll pass the floor to Andrei Sushensov, Dean, School of International Relations, MGIMO University. Our outstanding political scientist, head of a number of think tanks and program director of Valdai Discussion Club. He is also working in the International Processes Laboratory, author of numerous publications, and most importantly, apart from being a fellow, he is the one who trains the workforce, experts, the future generations of the Russian political science and diplomacy. Thank you so much, Mr. Repko, for your flattering introduction. That's a big honor for me to participate in that discussion. Speak about the domestic component or dimension of the American foreign policy is most relevant for analyzing the United States foreign policy rather than considering the Russian foreign policy regarding Russia. Depending on the discussions, some cultural wars and different phenomena that seem to us to be paradoxical. And for instance, Professor Legwold speaks about socialism in the United States, and quite fairly, the people of Soviet origin may ask a question what it is, how can we understand it? What we call MAGA revolution or Trumpist revolution has not only the domestic dimension, and that revolution could be traced back not only to the domestic life of the Americans, but this is about the rethinking of the today's realities by the political elite in the United States, the one that prioritizes strategic thinking, and I will try to justify that in my observations, some bullet points that I'd like to share with the participants in the Primakov Readings. This is for 10 years, starting from 2016, that American politics is very strongly driven by emotions in the attitude towards Russia. Donald Trump's victory during his first term launched, as far as we know now, a kind of a cultural war in the United States, and Russia all of a sudden has become an actor in the U.S. politics, although passive, and certainly Russia did not take any active part in such life. But the Russian threat, the Russian meddling in the elections has become actually a factor that was present in any discussions. That was the time when our contacts with Americans were quite intensive, and I remember one case when an aide to a high congressman asked me, what are the Russian interests in Ohio? Because his boss, the congressman, was supposed to make a pitch to his constituents, and he wanted to highlight that question in front of the constituency. So such funny episodes showed that, well, the American ruling class decided to sacrifice the U.S.-Russian relations for the sake of the domestic policy, and certainly the worsening of the relations started not back in 2016, but much earlier. 2016, this is a kind of a milestone, and Donald Trump was accused of being the Russian spy, and that has become a major factor for his first term. The American foreign policy was ideologized, meaning that was driven by the old ideology. And it resulted in the fact, and according to academician Dinkin, it resulted in the strategic madness as far as the United States believed that Russia could be defeated strategically. So this idea originates from 2021-2022. And the so-called the pyramid of trust and confidence was built by Donald Trump and his cronies, and a big coalition of the Europeans was brought about, and some of them consciously or subconsciously rendered political and financial resources, hoping that it would be a low-hanging fruit, a quick win, and that would reap some benefits from that quick win, and some strategic interests could be achieved. End of 2022 and early 2023, the American elites took a more sober look at the reality, and in January, a report avoiding the long war with Russia was published that stated that the American goals and Ukrainian goals are totally different, that the United States should avoid protruding the Ukrainian war, that may result in undesirable strategic consequences for the United States. And as of January 2023, the strategic goals of the United States in Ukraine were met, were achieved. So Russia and Europe were decoupled. The energy infrastructure that connected Russia and Germany was destroyed. Any centers of political autonomy were destroyed, and Ukraine is pegged to Europe, and Russia is weakened, etc. And very useful for the common perception of the reality was expressed that amid lots of resources that would be required to continue that conflict, the benefits for the United States from the continued crisis would go down. So it means that even the people surrounding Kamala Harris, the potential presidential candidate, stated that the U.S. attitude towards the Ukrainian crisis has to be modified. And only after Donald Trump being re-elected, a clarity was made that the international situation has changed dramatically. And Russia spoke about that as a polycentric or multipolar nascent world, whereas Evgeny Primakov wrote in 1996 in one of the articles that a multipole world, meaning that any country alone, even the United States, cannot impose a political will by force. They cannot impose that on Russia alone. They realized that they cannot impose any of such solutions or decisions on the allies, for instance, Turkey, which is a very convenient partner for the United States. There were some rifts between the United States and the European allies. The actually trade war between China and the United States has become another factor, and that brought about a new American strategy of national security in 2025. And if we read it thoroughly, it looks most like a textbook, a 101 textbook on the strategy of a maritime power in the world, which is globalized. We are using such language in our textbooks for MA students, describing the strategies, describing the needs of the state, what are the interests of the states, and how their needs could be grasped, because interests are a subjective category, and what resources the United States can rely on. So these are the very basic things that were born not today, but it is as if the American society tries to reset that, to rediscover that. And this document certainly focuses more on turning to the reality, the American resources are not unlimited, that American influence has certain limitations. And that document calls on adapting for such a new situation, understanding where the limits of the American interests are, and just fine-tuning the potential American actions. Certainly, the U.S. foreign policy under Trump started arguing against some of the sober and reasonable things articulated in that strategy. I do believe that Donald Trump and his administration now is converting a very important resource that accumulated over several years. I mean, the ideological support and value-based support that they created throughout several generations, and they convert that into a pool of tangible resources and tangible opportunities for the United States. That's about the bringing back the manufacturing capacity from the territory of the Allies back to the United States. And we'll see, for instance, what happens to the states next to Canada, whether actually they can raise a question of disintegrating from the United States. And the same is true for the situation and the recent developments in Cuba and in Venezuela and the attack against Iran. And sadly, each of those actions did not bear the dressing that was designed by the neocons many years ago. So before, it was a kind of a continental operation, seeking to defeat the country and then actually realigning or reshaping the opponent according to the American script book or templates. And before, the United States was ready to allocate much more resources than the United States is ready to allocate now. Donald Trump is ready to withdraw from the Iranian conflicts with less losses for the United States. But the American public opinion, the American media believes that that operation was a mistake, was a failure, but nevertheless, actually, the resources that were used are typical of a maritime power in its dealings with the land power. Now, the United States is trying to get back to the behavior of a maritime power in how it treats the continental powers. And it was very typical of the United States in the 19th century. And we actually can see actually some encroachments on Greenland and on Canada, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I certainly share your initial point, saying that on a lag with the relations between Russia and the United States have entered fast and deep worsening. The American policy regarding Russia was driven by the emotions and was predetermined by the emotions. And I also agree with what you have said, that despite that trend, there are still voices in the United States that call for a more realistic approach towards Russia, that call for a sober and reasonable assessment whether strategic defeat of Russia is realistic, is viable. And I would like to turn to other panelists with a question. Is there any direct correlation between the domestic processes in the United States and the scale of United States interventionism? We see that under Donald Trump a whole number of ideas and slogans that were incorporated into the fundamental doctrines in practice remain just statements, remain on paper. And the actions, if not opposite, but then do not match those statements. Do we see the domestic political component? Does the checks and balances system work? Or it depends on each and every international situation, what is called case by case? So if the emotions regarding Russia are too much, if certain regimes in the Western Hemisphere are breaking loose, what is the role of the American system? What can we expect in the future? And I asked that question to the Senior Fellow Director of Military Analysis, Defense Priorities, Jennifer Kavana. In her past life, she used to work in RAND Corporation, that we respect very much. And Mr. Sushentsov mentioned that just a minute ago. And she publishes a lot of articles and attracts lots of attention with the publication. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really glad to be here today. I think the Trump administration is not unique in writing documents that it then ignores in policy. That is something that's very characteristic of U.S. foreign policy. Documents like the National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy suck up a lot of bandwidth for U.S. policymakers in writing them, and then are usually irrelevant almost immediately after they're published. I think that has been largely the case under the Trump administration as well, although I do think that when it was published, it was a pretty good encapsulation of what the administration hoped to accomplish. I agree with my co-panelists that U.S. foreign policy is in a period of transition. For decades, there's been a bipartisan consensus that maintaining U.S. global dominance was really the only way to protect U.S. national security and economic prosperity. And that consensus simply no longer exists. Today, the foreign policy debate in Washington centers around a simple question: what should be the U.S. role in the world? In my view, this is not a debate that's happening along party lines. It's not a debate between MAGA Republicans who want to pull away from the world and Democrats who hope to return to the liberal international order. Instead, this debate and the battle over the future of U.S. foreign policy is being waged within each party, between those who seek to maintain U.S. primacy at any cost and those who hope for something entirely different, with a greatly reduced U.S. military footprint and set of commitments and alliances abroad. So if you want to understand the direction of U.S. foreign policy and what it will be over the coming decades, it's the internal debates that you need to watch most closely, not the inter-party competition between Republicans and Democrats. If you look at Trump's own base, for example, there are those who advocate for spending a lot more on military to maintain preeminence. These are the people who advocated strongly for the Iran war. There are those who want to shed some commitments so that we can focus heavily on militarized competition with China. And there are those who want to retrench from all commitments in Europe and Asia alike. And so my view is that there's not one MAGA foreign policy. There are many, and they align with different parts of Trump's own policy preferences. On the Democratic side, there's a similar spectrum of views, although it's a little bit hard to figure out what direction they're moving, largely because their current platform is not Trump. Democrats came out strongly against the Iran war, and now they're strongly against a deal to end the war. So it's really hard to figure out what they actually want. But when they're asked and forced to put forward constructive positions, they disagree a lot on what the right direction for the United States is, even if they can agree that the current one is not right. I guess I disagree a little bit with Robert in the sense that I don't think Trump is the cause of this debate or the changes that we're seeing in U.S. foreign policy. Instead, I think this debate existed before he came into office, and it will endure after he leaves. Trump is a symptom of dissatisfaction across the American electorate with promises of past presidents about the benefits and necessity of U.S. hegemony. After years of failed military interventions and living in a country in which there is always more money for war, but not money for education, for healthcare, for infrastructure, or for social services, an increasing number of Americans question whether being a global military power or the guardian of an international order is actually in their best interests. Trump has offered one answer to this question of what the US role in the world should be. He's clearly rejected the notion that the United States should underwrite the global security architecture. He's made it clear that he's not interested in carrying the security burdens for longtime allies in Europe and Asia. And he's shown an interest in resetting relationships with longtime rivals like Russia and China. At the same time, he's been very comfortable with use of unilateral US military force, ignoring traditional norms and rules that have guided US leaders. We've seen that in Venezuela, in Iran, and a whole range of other places. Now there's a debate about what will happen after the midterms, whether Trump's foreign policy will be fundamentally constrained or changed by what happens in the outcome. My view is that Trump's foreign policy and his position and ability to act unilaterally, domestically, and internationally won't change after the midterms. I actually don't think the midterms will matter that much, and I think all the focus placed on them is a distraction. And there are several reasons for this. The first, and probably most important, is that the US electoral map right now is so polarized that there are only about 24 contestable seats in all of Congress. That means seats that could be feasibly won by either party. So this idea that there's going to be a big blue wave or a big red wave anytime in the US's future, in my view, is wrong. The Democrats have a very low odds of winning the Senate, and even if they win most of the contestable seats in the House, they'll have only a very small political majority, which won't give them much power to do anything that will force Trump to change his policies. The most they can probably do is launch investigations or hold hearings. There's no guarantee these will be about foreign policy, and Trump will likely ignore this pressure anyway, like he did in the first term and like he's done to this point. But let's say the Democrats do beat the odds. They win majorities in the House and the Senate. I still don't think it will matter that much. They will have the ability to create more problems for Trump. They could hold up budgets. They could try to pass legislation that will prevent him from doing what he wants. But even these types of actions will require more political unity than the Democrats have, especially on foreign policy. As I said before, Democrats don't agree on what foreign policy should be, and this will prevent them, in my view, from placing any major constraints on Trump's actions. As will the fact that almost anything you do in the Senate requires 60 votes, which means that they'll have to get some Republican support for any types of major changes that they want to make. In any case, most of Trump's foreign policy actions actually aren't subject to congressional review. At this point, Congress is basically irrelevant to the practice of US foreign policy, and that's partly their own fault. They have abdicated their responsibilities and given up their authorities over decades. This is not specific to this administration. It's something that's been happening over time, at least since the early 2000s. Trump has done a lot to consolidate his executive power, more so than other presidents. That's been very helpful. And so I think the bottom line here is that Trump's freedom of action and his foreign policy won't change after the midterms. But what about what happens after Trump? I think that's really the more important question. Trump will be out of office in 2.5 years, and then the question is, what's next? My view is that whoever comes next, Democrat or Republican, won't be a repeat of Trump's foreign policy, but it won't be a return to the pre-Trump status quo either. And I think on this, Robert and I agree, because none of the 4 outcomes he suggested was a return to sort of a Biden-esque or a pre-Trump 2016 policy. Trump's willingness to discard the conventions of US foreign policy has opened up space for more significant change. And he's done a lot more in this second term to make institutional and transformational changes that will be really difficult for the next president to undo. Some examples are fundamentally changing the US relationship with allies, changing and reducing US involvement in NATO in institutional ways, such as changing contributions to the NATO force model and participation in NATO infrastructure, and reframing the US-China relationship around economic issues more than security. And this last one I think is important because Trump was the one who pushed the United States towards this framing of strategic competition with China as the guiding post of foreign policy that stayed under Biden, and the second Trump administration has really rejected that and changed it, I think, in fundamental ways that I don't think will allow the sort of China hawk consensus to come back. And all of these institutional changes will really limit the flexibility of the next president. But changing U.S. interests will reinforce these trends. So it's not just about Trump's success in institutionalizing or making sure these things can't be reversed. And in my view, this will make it almost impossible for a Biden-like transatlanticist to win future elections. U.S. core interests are increasingly moving away from Europe to Asia and elsewhere. And this is something that a growing number of policymakers recognize. Today's U.S. electorate doesn't look at Europe and a lot of traditional allies in the same way as past generations. There's no sense of moral obligation among younger voters to defend Europe, and a growing number of people in the United States believe that Europe's values are fundamentally out of sync with those of the United States. A candidate running with a transatlanticist or very traditional U.S. foreign policy, I think, will find little traction in the United States and will be out of sync with U.S. interests. But I don't think Trump represents the endpoint of U.S. foreign policy. Going forward, the most consequential decisions in the direction of U.S. foreign policy will continue to happen within party, and I think you already see that. The battle between the quote-unquote restrainers and those who want a more primacist U.S. foreign policy on the right have already started and are ongoing. And on the left, foreign policy among Democrats is never going to be the defining issue. Democrats are always going to focus more on domestic issues than on foreign policy. But no Democratic leader can explain how he or she will deliver on Democratic domestic policy preferences if they can't address this question of defense spending. You can't address the gaps in domestic policy without reducing and cutting a $1.5 or even $1 trillion defense budget. But regardless of the outcome of this 2028 election or these specific intra-party debates, I believe that the direction of U.S. foreign policy is towards greater restraint over time. That the two parties and these internal battles will converge in this direction may seem really hard to believe given the record of the past 6 months, and I acknowledge that. But there are two reasons why I think this is the case, so I will close by outlining these fundamental drivers of long-term U.S. foreign policy, I think. The first is simply resource constraints. The war in Iran has showed the limits of U.S. military power and drawn attention to the unsustainability of U.S. commitments abroad. The United States already spends $1 trillion, potentially now $1.5 trillion on defense, and this is more than 50% of U.S. discretionary spending. The debt of the U.S. national debt is now 100% of GDP, and interest on the debt is $1 trillion. This is not economically sustainable. There's also no political appetite for the tax increases or benefit cuts that would be required to fund long-term increases in defense spending. In any case, even more money can't really address the strategic insolvency of U.S. foreign policy, and I think more and more people see that today. The war in Iran is what the foreign policy hawks in the United States have wanted for decades. Like, I can't remember a time when a war in Iran wasn't the thing that the foreign policy hawks were arguing for, and they got it, and it was a disaster. So I think this is a really powerful argument against the sort of U.S. Approach to the world that I think will empower and give a lot of weight to restraint-oriented arguments about the unsustainability of U.S. foreign policy. So Trump will be the first of many presidents who will have to grapple with the constraints of U.S. power, the constraints on U.S. power, and the need for forced retrenchment. Eventually, the U.S. will have to give up some of these commitments. And the second factor is generational change in attitudes towards U.S. foreign policy. Those calling for efforts to sustain U.S. primacy are at the end of their careers. Among policymakers and voters who are under 50, the desire for a much reduced U.S. foreign policy is significant and growing. For these individuals, Democrats and Republicans, their entire lives have been dominated by failed American wars of choice in Iraq and Afghanistan, now in Iran, and U.S. involvement in conflicts across continents everywhere. The first real foreign policy event I remember was the first Gulf War, and since then I can't remember a time when the U.S. wasn't bombing somebody. And that's not uncommon for people who are about my age. So for these Americans, the bottom line is that a foreign policy based on American dominance hasn't made them safer, and it hasn't made them better off. So for this younger generation of leaders, as they gain more influence, they're changing preferences, and their skepticism about US military power and US military primacy, I think, will make it easier for the United States to give up military commitments, despite the fact that a reduced US role in the world will come with negative consequences, including reduced influence in some domains. And they'll be able to more radically reimagine the US approach to the world. And this could mean a smaller military, it could mean a reduced US forward posture, it could mean a very different relationship with Russia and China. And I think most importantly, for people here in Russia, these younger cohorts are eager to discard this Cold War narrative, this Cold War framing of the world where it's us versus them. And this is true not only with views towards Russia, but also China and even Iran. And this, I think, breaks what has been sort of this last stronghold of the US foreign policy hawks, this specific framing. So I see the current changes in US foreign policy as the opening, not the closing of a window. US foreign policy will change, even if we're not sure exactly how yet. For me, the biggest and most interesting question is how quickly these changes will happen.
Thank you so much, Jennifer Kavanagh, for very interesting and deep analysis of the balance of powers, those who analyze inter-partisan and inside-partisan relations when it comes to the revolution in the American foreign policy. There are many things to think over when it comes to the lack of direct relation, whether you belong to Democrats and Republicans, and how you perceive the level of American interventionism globally. I'd like to draw your attention to the points voiced by Ms. Kavanagh in relation to level of influence of allocated budget for military spendings versus the efficiency in achieving goals that the United States sets globally, regionally. There is a point that regardless of the Constitution stipulated role of the Parliament of the Senate in the Constitution to control the spendings, I don't see personally specific objections when the administration increases military spendings and aim at 1.5 trillion threshold. What does administration of Trump mean for the whole system? The panelists have talked about this matter at different angles. It requires further discussion as well. So how serious this Trump administration footprint on the American system after 2028? Whether there is some room for optimism if they get back to the Democrat principles on the Russian track. These are very important topics. We can speak about tariffs as one of the another foreign policy tools and the role of an arbitrator, which has been mentioned during our panel discussion, and how the administration follows the Supreme Court decisions and the income because of these tariffs. It's a separate point. I'd like to ask Ms. Zhuravlyova to comment on that, the Deputy Director for Scientific Work of IMAMO and the head of the Center for North American Research. Very distinguished specialist abroad due to her contribution to the American science studies. I'm going to ask her this question. Over to you, distinguished Ms. Zhuravlyova. Thank you, Mr. Ryabkov. I would like to elaborate on 2 points which have been voiced by our American colleagues, which are key characteristics of the current foreign policy of the United States. The first is mentioned by Robert, that the foreign policy is a function of the domestic policy. It has always been the case for American foreign policy, not only today. And the second point, that what Jennifer has said, that there is no single unified foreign policy in the United States. There is a foreign policy concepts within Democrats, a lot with the Republicans. And the main thing and most interesting thing, there is a president who doesn't only have his own vision, but he has his own behavioral pattern in foreign policy, which actually kind of breaks these concepts within two parties. These key features or characteristics can be explained by several trends, which can be witnessed in American domestic policy. The first, and that what Robert has mentioned, bigger executive power. Trump as an image of the strengthened executive power of the United States. In fact, it seems to me that Trump is a manifestation of this long-term trajectory. He is not the first president who is moving in this direction and leading the United States in this particular way. So this is a response, this is the outcome of bigger populism in domestic American policy. Populism is a response to dissatisfaction of voters, both with the Democrats and the Republicans. This slow motion of the federal process in decision making, and the key is the personality of the president. Not the fact that he belongs to the Republicans, what he represents himself, and those hopes that are set for every incoming president are mostly connected not with the belonging to a particular party, but with his personal characteristics. That was the case with Obama. That is the case with Trump. These are two different people, two different, absolutely different presidents with different style of behavior. But these are two presidents, two populist presidents.
Yeah. But at the same time, these are the presidents who encourage the institutional competition. This is the second feature, I believe, of the current domestic political process. In response to the activity of the president, in response to the populism of the executive power, the institutional competition is on the rise. And foreign policy here becomes the sphere where that competition manifests itself. This is like a litmus test that reveals that attempt of the U.S. Congress to once again fight for control over the president. And such presidents as Donald Trump, being overly emotional and very energetic, it puzzles the executive authority and gives an impression of unmanageability. And the environment becomes even more competitive. And it translates in the fact that the party loyalty makes room to the institutional loyalty. This is what we see in the U.S. Congress now, when part of the Republican Party is ready to support the Democratic Party in voting. This is what we saw in terms of the House voting on the new law on limitations and restrictions regarding Russia and supporting Ukraine. When the draft law was endorsed thanks to the Republican support in opposition to president as something to counter the U.S. president. So the law was intended to somehow confine Donald Trump in his foreign policy, in his stance regarding Russia. And very often, Russia is the bargaining chip. And those inner tensions manifest themselves in discussions regarding Russia. And usually, actually, there might be some bargaining or swap between the parties on the issues associated with Russia. The third feature, something that manifests itself in the foreign policy and in the domestic policy. This is ongoing strengthening of the extreme wings of the parties, so the left-wing party in Democrats and right-wing party in Republican Party. And Donald Trump, who came to power capitalizing on those sentiments, he strengthened the right-wing populism in the Republican Party. And in essence, MAGA, this is the Donald Trump's legacy in the Republican Party. And that legacy, in my opinion, is quite stable. And there are lots of chances that the Republican Party would keep the trend in moving in that very direction. Probably. Certain components of the MAGA policy would change, but the overall trend would remain the same. As for the Democratic Party is concerned, the strengthening of the left-wing component of the party and its expansion has become a response to what is going on in the Republican Party. But on the other hand, this is a response to the leftist movements in the American society. This is for 10 years. The balance between the left wing and right wing is changing. So there are more than 37% of conservatives, and liberals are less numerous. But in the last decade, the liberal sentiments are somehow growing, and therefore the ruling party has to react to that, betting on the left-wing component of its party. Those processes in both parties are mutually complementing, so they act in a synchronized way. But at the same time, we can say that actually stronger left wing in one party strengthens the right wing in the other party. Now, we can speak about the leftist radicalization, and such processes would follow the processes within the Republican Party. So the right conservative bias could be not imagined without certain processes in the Democratic Party. Now we see that the leftist movement in the Democratic Party now is supported by the right-wing moves in the Republican Party. For instance, before, the parties could agree on all the main points of the agenda, and this is not the case now. I do think that both parties are going to sponsor more radicalized approach in that sense. And that process would be somehow confined by the difficulties in the Democratic Party when nominating a leader. We see that starting from the elections, starting from the previous presidential elections. And this goes amid the lack of homogeneity of the left-wing voters. So the right-wing voters are not homogeneous either. Even the right-wing cons, well, they are diverse, but Donald Trump has become the person who unified the constituency, the president who doesn't look like anyone else. With his party format, he managed to unite the right conservative constituency, and Democrats would need their own Donald Trump. They're afraid of that, and to some extent it is associated with the fact that still the American society is more conservative than it is liberal, and Democrats are afraid of nominating such a candidate who would express the leftist sentiments. If we look at what is going on with the future nominees from the Democratic Party, for instance, Alexandra Cortez, and one of her competitors, that's Rock Hanna, both of them are seeking a more moderate rhetoric. They move from the camp of the opposition and resistance, and while they are being promoted to the federal level, they are not so eloquent, and they try to present themselves as more moderate ones. But the question is it what the Democratic Party needs now? Does the Democratic Party need a candidate that tries to sit well within certain format? I do think that the Democratic Party has less chances of coming to power and would have more chances to win in the next elections if they could have nominated a candidate like Donald Trump. And the last feature that I can name is the rising institutional competition is becoming a factor behind bipartisan coalitions in the U.S. Congress. This is what we see in all the votings. For instance, when attempts were made to stop Trump in his Iranian campaign, this is what is going on when the Russian agenda is being discussed. This is why the parties cannot agree on the domestic issues, but they may and they manage, they do well in agreeing on the foreign policy, on the rise of that institutional competition. They may agree on the foreign policy items. The conclusion that we can make is that fear that emerged in the left liberal media once Donald Trump came to power, when he was accused of being authoritarian, exactly this may bring about more stability to the parties. In response to the populist radical feature of the president, they can actually bring about the bipartisan agreement that we didn't see for many, many years. And this will not happen overnight. This is a midterm trend. But I do think that this may happen. This is one of the vectors of the transformation that now is taking place within the United States. And that has a spillover effect on the foreign policy. We should not expect that in case of the change of the party control, the U.S. foreign policy would keep its current rationale. Now, certainly, Democrats, if they come to power, would change that, although the main pillar would remain the same. But potential rapprochement in the midterm may become the U.S. foreign policy more stable, more predictable. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. Zhuravleva. Thank you for drawing our attention to some phenomena, such as the behavioral patterns in foreign policy of the country. And certainly not the party affiliation, but rather the personality that matters, that becomes the main factor of foreign policy that sets the vector of the foreign policy. When the party loyalty makes room for, or less important than, the institutional loyalty. This is something that can describe the American foreign policy in the years to come. And sadly, strengthening of the right-wing and left-wing components of both parties, this is something that we can consider. We have only 15 minutes for a discussion, and I accept the questions, and please introduce yourself. The mics would be passed, so please. And please introduce yourself. Dear colleagues, Tsvetkova Natalia from the United States and Canada Institute. Ms. Zhuravlyova, thank you so much for your contribution. Let me get back to what you have said. So you said that if the Democrats could have their own Donald Trump. Remember 2016 when Sanders and socialism was mentioned more than once today. So he is the leftist representative of the Democrat Party. And he was running, we know that story, that really the Democratic Committee, as the young people put that, banned that candidate electing Hillary Clinton. And we saw the results of the elections. So these are the two outstanding leaders of both parties. So Sanders versus Donald Trump. So if it were the situation, would the political system of the United States forget about Donald Trump back in 2020? And there would be no such populism and radicalization. So meaning that they would let this team out. But nomination of Hillary Clinton prevented such a situation. So this is my question. Thank you so much, Ms. Tsvetkova. That was a very interesting question. In essence, I would agree that really Clinton as the nominee and the democratic sentiments, that could be the safety valve that would prevent an explosion. Would anything change if Sanders was nominated instead of Hillary Clinton? My question is, what would happen if, and whether Sanders could have won that election, because that was not the time of the time of Sanders has not come yet then. Again, I believe this strengthening comes from Obama times. It is very unlikely that Donald Trump would be not so irritating as it is now, even despite the presence of Clinton. So they move towards populism and the emergence of the populist leaders. This is one phenomenon, and resistance of the establishment to the same process. This is another factor that speaks about more slow processes in the Democratic Party. Thank you so much. Yep. Over to you. Glazova Anna from the Russian Institute of Strategic Research. Today's forum is called The World Without Rules, Power Game. And probably we even can omit the question sign. Question mark. So it has... Thucydides' statement has become very fashionable. The strong states can do whatever they want, and the weak states have to do what they have to do. In the current situation, countries that pursue the policy of peace through strength, do they have some objective limitations to such a policy? Then what these limitations are, and how far they can go in pursuing such a policy? I turn to the panelists. Who wants to take that question? Who can comment on that question? Thucydides is a very fashionable modern political scientist. All of a sudden, he has become very relevant. And ironically, Thucydides was very frank in describing the developments in the ancient Greece without any leeways, and actually there were no reasons why Thucydides was supposed to be politically correct. I love the ancient Greek period, and I will not describe how the military conflicts would be settled down and what it meant for the civilians, but certainly Thucydides described the rules of interaction between the states, and the force is still the main denominator of the national might. This is something that remains unchanged. But today's generations are brought up by the paradigm that cropped out following the results of the World War II. And the World War II is the most devastating event of the last 1,000 years in the life of the mankind. And it made a preventive injection against hostilities of a catastrophic scale. And once the nuclear weapons were developed, any potential major conflict may be disastrous for everyone, even those that were not engaged in the conflict directly. But still, the power as the last resort tool is the key circumstance, or the key factor that has to be considered. This year, me and my colleagues were publishing a textbook on the modern international relations. And we look at the period from 2008 through 2025. We try to explain to the students what happened in that period of time.
To describe bilateral relations between many countries, we use a metaphor. I do understand that it's not quite academic, but we use metaphor of Atlants who keep the sky, the Atlantices who keep the sky intact. Big countries, regardless of being the guarantors of order, so they depend on each other. If the countries start to use power and force to protect not their interests but secondary interests, or striving for hegemony, for primacy, to maximize their interests, so they victimize the peace, stability, and inevitably it impacts those who initiate these processes. So the fact is that power is still a key denominator of national might, military power. I believe from my standpoint, we need to put it up with it. So it is a reality. It has never been different. But nevertheless, apart from that, all these superpowers have common responsibility. They have common goal. Even within the Ukrainian crisis, the United States and Russia signaled to each other that there are some red lines which you shouldn't cross. And they are to avoid the existential threat to both states. I believe that this reciprocal understanding of these limitations by superpowers is still works regardless of different technological developments and military arsenals. Although there is a big challenge, this is AI, robotics in a military battlefield. Very soon we will see the battlefield where the human component is going to be to change, will be mitigated, and the automation of all these processes and use of the systems which are used for civic purposes. And this is going to be a huge challenge for what you have asked the question about. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's move on. Over to you, please. Nada Gigawashvili, the Institute of Canada and the United States. Thank you, dear speakers and distinguished speakers, for very interesting presentations. I have the question. So we've been talking about the necessity to work out new rules, new code of conduct for the world order. I do understand that my question is partially hypothetical. So what can force the development or working out of such rules as this code of conduct, and how we can get back all the countries to follow these code of conduct if everyone keeps on saying that I don't want to follow it, I will not follow these or specific rule. Thank you. Dear colleagues, maybe anyone from our American participants can comment on this. Jennifer, please, over to you.
I think it's an interesting question. I guess my pessimistic view is, has there ever been a code of conduct that all states followed? I would say no. At the end of World War II, there was an effort to set up international governance structure and a set of international laws and norms that most states followed most of the time. But going back to the previous question, major powers have always been able to discard rules when they want to. And international law, at least in the US context, which is what I know best, is often used as a pretext. The United States follows international law when it accords with US interests, and when it doesn't accord with US interests, it discards it. In terms of thinking about what it will take to develop a new code of conduct, a new set of rules, I think the first thing would be an initiative and willingness among great powers to be involved in it. And it would have to be all great powers. And right now, I guess I don't see the US as interested in that discussion. There's a discussion in the United States about, at least among the Trump administration, has sparked a discussion about the ways in which the old norms and rules didn't serve US interests or don't serve US interests anymore. But the discussion about what the next set of rules, at least at the international level, isn't happening, mostly because I think the current administration is much more comfortable dealing in a unilateral fashion with other countries and working on a bilateral level with specific leaders and specific partners, rather than thinking in multilateral context. And I know that that's different than the conversation that's happening outside the United States, in places like China and Russia and the global south, where there's an interest in thinking about the flaws of the current multilateral order and how new norms and new institutions or institutional reform can repair the old code of conduct. And so until that disconnect is repaired, until the United States, I think, is ready to engage in the discussion about what the next set of rules look like, I guess I'm pessimistic on that conversation happening in a way that actually affects state behavior. Now, of course, there's also the possibility that the rest of the world has this conversation and comes up with a set of norms and rules without the United States, and the US isn't included. And then you have the United States acting on its own over here in a set of rules, but I guess I'm not sure that works, because even a more restrained US foreign policy, even a United States that is relatively weaker compared to other major power centers in the world, will still be a major power. And if it's outside of the rules and norms, then I'm not sure the utility of those rules and norms in guiding how especially major powers interact with each other.
Thank you very much. The floor to Professor Legvold, who wants to express his opinion.
Of conduct operates at very different levels. it is necessary, it's conceivable to think about a code of conduct among major powers in dealing with what will be becoming the threats of AI and the way in which will affect military relations, the operation of arms control and along the line at that level. But in terms of codes of conduct for regulating the overall set of international relations among major powers and how major powers conduct themselves in general, I agree with Jennifer. First of all, I don't think that existed before. You did have at one level a basic kind of a rule, and that was that after World War II, that countries would not change borders with the use of force. That is the basic rule of territorial integrity within that context. That rule has obviously gone by the boards. It was enforced a little bit in the context of the war against Saddam Hussein in the war in the Middle East during that period of time. But I think what one is really looking for in these circumstances, in a way it was a part of what Tom Graham was arguing this morning, is a modus vivendi, a basis for a modus vivendi as opposed to a specific code of conduct. And if you take something like the relationship where that's the most necessary right now, which is the US and China, because if that relationship continues to operate without any kind of a sense of modus vivendi, then it will be fundamentally destabilizing and disorienting for the rest of the international community. The way you would think about modus vivendi between the United States and China is a little bit the way in which in the last stages of the Cold War we began to develop a modus vivendi, beginning with the period of détente in the US-Soviet relationship. But more specifically, you have people on the US side, people like Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, who often also happens to be one of the finest scientists in the world, who's arguing for managed strategic competition. And what would be required for managed strategic competition? There are very specific things. It would be a reinforcement by the United States of a one China policy, a limitation of maneuvers on the part of the Chinese, and a reciprocity in terms on the part of the United States in what you're doing in that context. And I think by and large, if there is going to be, in the world that all of the panelists have been describing up to this point, some level of stability, it has to be leaders who are beginning to focus again on what kind of a modus vivendi will be acceptable. And that, at the current moment, is not the nature of great power relations, that is, governments at that level working on that specific issue. So code of conduct as a general proposition doesn't make sense to me. Code of conduct in dealing with AI in the future, that makes sense to me.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our time is up. 1 hour and 30 minutes is over. Before we thank our distinguished panelists and speakers, I'd like to draw attention to one moment. Professor Legvold, if I'm not mistaken, you are the only one who said the arms control phrase. That brings us to very deep elaborations. It happened 40 seconds before we ran out of time. Like yesterday, Lionel Messi scored at the 6th additional minute his second historical goal. I do hope that the attention to this topic will not be too close to zero level like we have done during our panel session. This is a very important topic, very important tool to strengthen security of the states. I would like to thank all the participants of the panel discussion for very deep and fundamental elaborations. I do believe that our discussion has been very fruitful, aspiring for the future, looking ahead into the future. You know, we're not, there is silver line in the sky. I wish you all the best.